And I am a business class passenger, Mrs. Banks replied calmly. Jessica's brow twitched. She handed the ticket back, but didn't move. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder at Brandon, who had been lingering nearby. I need to confirm something, she muttered before striding toward the galley, speaking in hushed tones with her colleague.
Welcome again to this channel. This is a story of racial prejudice. Relax and watch how the whole saga happened. Racial prejudice should be a thing of the past. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel.
The bustling halls of JFK International Airport pulsed with energy as travelers hurried through security checkpoints, clutching passports and boarding passes. The rhythmic hum of announcements echoed overhead, interspersed with the chatter of excited tourists and weary businessmen. Among the sea of faces, Mrs. Banks stood out, not for any ostentation, but for her quiet grace. Dressed in a regal yet simple Ankara gown, its deep blue fabric adorned with golden embroidery, she carried herself with a dignity that commanded respect. At 70 years old, Mrs. Banks had seen the world change in many ways, but some things remained the same. Her son, Adeolu Banks, the Nigerian Minister of Aviation, had insisted she fly business class for her journey home. Mama, you deserve to travel in comfort, he had said when booking her ticket. But Mrs. Banks was never one to flaunt privilege. If it were up to her, she would have taken an economy seat, just as she had for most of her life. As she approached the business class check-in counter, a tall, stern-faced agent barely spared her a glance before muttering, "Economy check-in is that way, ma'am." Mrs. Banks smiled politely as she handed over her passport and ticket. "I believe I am in the right place." The agent blinked, glanced at the ticket, and forced a thin-lipped smile. "Ah, I see. Right this way, ma'am." Even with the correction, Mrs. Banks could sense the doubt in his tone. She was accustomed to it, the subtle questioning of her presence in spaces considered elite. But she had long since learned to brush it aside. Security was a process she had mastered over years of travel. She removed her shoes, placed her neatly packed handbag on the conveyor belt, and walked through the scanner with practiced ease. Yet, as she gathered her belongings, she caught the lingering gaze of a young TSA officer, his eyes shifting between her and the luxury boarding pass in her hand. She met his gaze with the same composed expression she had perfected over time. "Something wrong, young man?" The officer hesitated before shaking his head. "No, ma'am. Have a nice flight." Mrs. Banks continued to the lounge, where plush leather seats and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee welcomed business class passengers. Choosing a quiet corner near the window, she savored the view of airplanes lined up like metallic birds poised for flight. As she sipped her tea, she overheard snippets of conversations, investment deals, luxury vacations, political discussions. The exclusivity of the space was unmistakable. When the boarding call echoed through the lounge, Mrs. Banks gathered her belongings and made her way to the gate. As she approached the priority boarding lane, the attendant stationed there, a young woman with sleek blonde hair neatly tied in a bun, glanced at her, a flicker of hesitation crossing her eyes. "Ma'am, this lane is for business class boarding," the woman said. Mrs. Banks remained composed, though a familiar wariness settled in her chest. "And that is precisely why I am here," she replied, presenting her ticket. The attendant's expression shifted almost instantly, professionalism taking over. "Of course, ma'am. Right this way." The moment she stepped onto the aircraft, she sensed a shift, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The rich scent of leather seats and expensive cologne lingered in the air. business class passengers were already settled, some engrossed in newspapers, others adjusting their seats into reclining positions. Mrs. Banks located her seat, 3A, a window seat with extra legroom. Carefully placing her handbag in the compartment beside her, she felt a small wave of relief. She was finally on her way home. As she settled in, a male flight attendant, tall, with a sharp jawline and a name tag reading Brandon, walked past, his eyes briefly scanning her before moving on. Moments later, another flight attendant, Jessica, a young woman with piercing blue eyes and a crisp uniform, approached and stopped directly in front of Mrs. Banks. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone carefully measured. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Mrs. Banks looked up, her expression unreadable. She had been here before, in different ways, in different settings, and she already knew how this would go. Taking a slow, steady breath, she reached into the side pocket of her handbag. She retrieved the crisp boarding pass and handed it over. Jessica took it, her manicured fingers gripping the paper a little too tightly as her eyes flickered across the details. Suspicion curled subtly at the edges of her lips, barely concealed. "This seat is for business class passengers," Jessica said, a faint sharpness in her voice. "And I am a business class passenger," Mrs. Banks replied calmly. Jessica's brow twitched. She handed the ticket back, but didn't move. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder at Brandon, who had been lingering nearby. "I need to confirm something," she muttered before striding toward the galley, speaking in hushed tones with her colleague. Mrs. Banks remained still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The businessman in the next seat, a gray-haired gentleman in a tailored suit, cast her a brief glance before returning to his newspaper. Across the aisle, a woman in her 30s, dressed in a designer blazer, observed the scene unfold with quiet curiosity. Minutes later, Jessica returned, her posture stiff. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Mrs. Banks frowned, her voice steady. "Why?" Jessica hesitated before responding, her eyes flicking toward Brandon. "We have reason to believe that this ticket does not belong to you." A sharp silence filled the air. Mrs. Banks turned slightly in her seat, her gaze sweeping over the growing number of passengers paying attention. She could feel the heat of their stares, some sympathetic, others merely entertained by the unfolding spectacle. "My son purchased this ticket for me," she said, her voice unwavering. "I have traveled in business class before, and I will not be leaving my seat." Jessica exhaled sharply, folding her arms. "Ma'am, I need you to cooperate." A deep voice interrupted. "Is there a problem here?" It was the businessman beside her, lowering his newspaper. His piercing blue eyes flicked between Jessica and Mrs. Banks. Jessica stiffened. "Sir, this does not concern you." "It absolutely does. I've been sitting here the entire time, and I see no reason why this lady should move." The murmuring among the passengers grew. A few pulled out their phones. Brandon stepped forward. "If you do not comply, ma'am, we will be forced to escort you off this flight." A sharp pang struck Mrs. Banks's chest. The last thing she wanted was a scene. And yet, the injustice of it all made her stomach tighten. Despite the humiliation burning inside her, she exhaled and stood up. A slow, deliberate movement. As she gathered her handbag, the businessman spoke again, his voice colder now. "This is disgraceful," he muttered. "Utterly disgraceful." But Mrs. Banks said nothing. Instead, she walked, head held high, past the whispering passengers, past the flight attendants, past the sneering doubt, and toward the back of the plane, where they thought she belonged. but they had no idea who she was. Not yet. Mrs. Banks settled into the cramped economy seat, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the armrests. The low hum of the plane did little to drown out the pounding in her chest. She blinked rapidly, forcing back the tears that threatened to spill. She had seen this before, this look of doubt, this unspoken accusation, this quiet yet deafening exclusion. Her mind drifted back to the past, to the restaurant in Mississippi, where she had been denied service in 1968 because of the color of her skin. To the college professor who had sneered at her ambition, telling her a woman like her should be satisfied with less. To the shopping mall security guard who had followed her every step as if expecting her to steal. She had spent a lifetime fighting to be seen, to be respected. And here she was, 70 years old, still facing the same battle. A gentle voice broke through her thoughts. I saw everything. She turned to see a young woman, barely 30, holding up her phone. The screen displayed a paused video. Jessica's stern face, Brandon's stiff posture, Mrs. Banks standing tall. I recorded it, the woman whispered. The world is going to see this. Mrs. Banks exhaled slowly. For the first time since boarding, she allowed a single tear to fall. The plane touched down in Lagos, Nigeria, after a long and silent flight. Mrs. Banks descended the stairs with quiet dignity, her simple handbag clutched in her hand. Standing at the arrival gate, tall and commanding, was her son, Adeolu Banks. His sharp eyes scanned the disembarking passengers until they landed on her. Instantly, he knew something was wrong. Mom, he said as he approached, concern etched on his face. What happened? Mrs. Banks hesitated before answering. Not here, my son. But the world had already begun speaking for her. As they drove home, Adeolu's phone buzzed incessantly. A flood of messages, calls, and news alerts. He finally opened a link sent by one of his aides. The video was everywhere, across social media, news outlets, even international headlines. Elderly black woman humiliated on business class flight, airline under fire. The footage was undeniable. The flight attendant's dismissive tone, the hushed whispers of passengers, the look of betrayal in Mrs. Banks' eyes. Adeolu tightened his grip on the phone. The airline was about to learn who they had disrespected, and the world was watching. As the days passed, the world watched as the scandal surrounding Mrs. Banks's humiliation unfolded in real time. The footage capturing the moment she was dragged from her business class seat had gone viral in a matter of hours. Social media erupted with anger, with hashtags like Respect the Elderly, Justice for Mrs. Banks, and airline discrimination trending worldwide. Across the globe, passengers and civil rights organizations voiced their outrage. Many were shocked by the stark discrimination on display. An elderly black woman seemingly out of place in a world of wealth and privilege. The real storm was come. In Nigeria, news outlets with orders covered the tracy. Mrs. Banks' son, Adio Banks, who now is of the political stage as Nigeria's Minister of Aviation, waste no time. The morning after the incident, as Adeolu sat in his office, the phone calls began pouring in. His aides buzzed with information, press releases, and urgent updates. His inbox was filled with messages of support from all corners of the country. But there was one thing that kept him up at night: the pain in his mother's eyes. She had fought too hard to be treated with dignity to let this slide. Adeolu knew he could not let this injustice go unanswered. His mother, a woman of grace and resilience, had been humiliated on a global stage. He couldn't let that stand. That afternoon, the airline issued a formal apology. They claimed to be deeply saddened by the incident and vowed to investigate. But Adeolu was not appeased by their standard corporate response. He demanded more. He knew they had to face the consequences of their actions, and he would make sure they did. As the days wore on, the airline scrambled to contain the fallout. Their PR teams were working around the clock, issuing apologies and press statements. They expressed regret, stating that unfortunate miscommunications led to Mrs. Banks's treatment. But it was clear that the damage had been done. Behind the scenes, the airline's executives were holding emergency meetings. They had underestimated the backlash. The incident wasn't just a moment of poor judgment. It was a reflection of systemic discrimination that had no place in the 21st century. The airline knew they had a public relations nightmare on their hands, and they were doing everything in their power to save face. Despite their efforts, Adeolu was not backing down. He had already begun working with his legal team, and the Nigerian government was rallying behind him. By the end of the week, he had called a press conference. Standing before the cameras, Adeolu's presence was commanding. His voice was steady but filled with an unmistakable sense of resolve. Today, I stand before you not just as the Minister of Aviation, but as the son of a mother who has endured too much, he began, his eyes piercing into the camera lens. What happened to my mother on that flight was not just an unfortunate mistake. It was a reflection of a system that continues to marginalize Black people, especially our elders. The press gallery was silent. Cameras flashed, and reporters leaned forward, sensing the gravity of his words. This is not just a matter of inconvenience, he continued. It is a matter of human dignity. The airline's actions have caused irreparable harm to my mother, and I will not allow this to be swept under the rug. I demand accountability. His statement sent shockwaves through the media. The story shifted from being about a single incident of discrimination to a broader conversation about systemic racism, corporate accountability, and the treatment of Black people in spaces of privilege. The pressure mounted on the airline. The public pressure was relentless. After days of speculation and scrutiny, the airline CEO was forced to appear before the press. In a tense live broadcast, he delivered an apology, but the words rang hollow. "We deeply regret the incident," he said, his voice tight. "We are committed to making changes in our policies to ensure this never happens again." But the apology did little to quell the growing firestorm. The airline's attempt to defuse the situation only made it worse. People could sense the disingenuousness in the corporate rhetoric. They were not satisfied with mere words. They demanded real change. In the days that followed, it became clear that the flight attendants involved in Mrs. Banks' mistreatment would not escape unscathed. Brandon and Jessica, the two attendants who had humiliated her, were placed on indefinite leave. After an internal review, they were formally dismissed, their actions deemed a violation of the airline's code of conduct. The airline announced sweeping policy changes. They would implement anti-racism and diversity training for all flight crew and staff. Business class passengers would now be randomly selected for customer experience checks to ensure that all individuals, regardless of their background, would be treated with respect and dignity. The airline also made a public promise to establish a dedicated department to investigate complaints of racial discrimination. But for Mrs. Banks, the damage had already been done. No amount of policy change could erase the humiliation she had suffered, and she was resolute in her decision. She would not allow her experience to fade into the background, no matter how much the airline tried to mitigate the damage. For Adeolu, the battle was far from over. As Minister of Aviation, he vowed to use his position to hold the airline accountable. The government would no longer allow businesses to perpetuate such discrimination, and Adeolu's voice would ensure that no one else would be treated the way his mother had been. The incident sparked a larger conversation about the treatment of Black travelers in the aviation industry, and the ripple effects were felt in other sectors. What began as a personal injustice had become a global reckoning, and Mrs. Banks's quiet strength had sparked a movement that could not be ignored. The airline would never forget the lesson they had learned the hard way. But the real victory lay in the change that came from it, the acknowledgement that no one, regardless of their age or skin color, should ever be made to feel inferior simply because they chose to occupy a space that society believed was not meant for them. The wheels of retribution had turned, and Mrs. Banks had emerged not just as a victim, but as a symbol of dignity and resistance. The weeks following the scandal were a whirlwind for Mrs. Banks. The world had seen her at her most vulnerable, and though the initial sting of the humiliation lingered, she began to feel the embrace of support from all corners of society. The outpouring of love, solidarity, and empathy was overwhelming. At first, Mrs. Banks found it hard to accept the attention. She had always prided herself on humility, preferring to stay out of the spotlight. But the calls of support came in waves, from strangers on the street, old friends she hadn't spoken to in years, and even fellow passengers on flights who had witnessed her ordeal. Each word of kindness reminded her of the strength she had spent a lifetime cultivating. There were letters, messages, and even flowers delivered to her doorstep. A particularly touching one came from an elderly woman in California who shared a story of her own experiences with racial prejudice. "Your strength reminds me of my own mother," the woman wrote. "I never thought I would see someone like you treated this way in my lifetime, but now that I've seen it, I know I have to speak out. You're not alone." With every message, Mrs. Banks felt a small piece of her pain chip away. In a way, her suffering had become a catalyst for something bigger. But it was her son, Adeolu, who remained by her side through it all. Despite the mounting pressure from international media and government officials, he ensured that his mother was protected from the frenzy. He helped her sort through the support, deciding which parts of the story to share with the public and which to keep private. In one of their quieter moments at home, as Adeolu sat next to her in their living room, Mrs. Banks looked up at her son. Her eyes, once filled with the sting of injustice, now held a quiet resolve. "My son," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I never wanted this attention, but I see now that it wasn't just about me. It's about all of us. I've fought for dignity all my life, but I never thought the world would see what happens behind closed doors. Now they've seen it, and we must not let this moment pass." Adeolu nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of his mother's words. He had promised her that he would use his position as Minister of Aviation to ensure that this kind of injustice would never be allowed again. And he intended to keep that promise, not just for his mother, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than they were because of the color of their skin. "We will make sure that this doesn't just fade away," Adeolu said, his voice full of determination. I will ensure that international aviation standards address this issue head on. And true to his word, Adeolu initiated a series of international talks with aviation regulatory bodies and representatives from civil rights organizations. He used his influence to push for mandatory anti-racism training for flight crew worldwide, not just as a one-time seminar, but as part of the ongoing certification process. The discussions also led to a global petition advocating for the establishment of an independent body to investigate and hold airlines accountable for racial discrimination. But it was more than just policy that Adeolu was fighting for. It was a change in the cultural mindset of the airline industry. The way passengers of color were perceived, especially elderly passengers, needed to be addressed on every level. He worked tirelessly, lobbying for the implementation of new international guidelines that would protect travelers from the kind of discrimination his mother had endured. Behind the scenes, the airline involved, despite their best efforts to rebuild their image, was forced to reevaluate their practices. They could no longer hide behind their old methods, no longer ignore the voices of their passengers. Their outdated assumptions about what made someone worthy of a business class seat were now exposed for all to see. In her quiet moments, Mrs. Banks reflected on the impact her experience had on the world. She had been through so much in her life: discrimination, hardship, and the weight of history. Yet, in her 70s, she had become a catalyst for change. She had given voice to the countless individuals who had been silenced, ignored, and marginalized. Despite the emotional scars, she found herself unexpectedly proud. Proud of the strength she had shown, proud of the way her son had handled the situation with dignity, and proud that she had been able to spark a conversation that would lead to real, lasting change. "I never imagined," she said softly, her hand resting on Adeolu's, "that it would take something like this for people to see. But now, maybe they will understand." Adeolu squeezed her hand, his eyes softening. "Mama, you taught me to fight for what's right, no matter the cost. This is just the beginning. We will continue to fight." The resolution, in many ways, was just the start of a much larger journey. The airline's apology was only a small part of the ongoing effort to ensure that no one would ever experience the same kind of humiliation that Mrs. Banks had faced. But in the quiet moments when the media buzz died down and the world moved on to its next story, it was clear that something deep had shifted. Not just in the aviation industry, but in every industry that had turned a blind eye to racial injustice. In the end, Mrs. Banks's resolve remained unshaken. The pain of the past would always be a part of her, but so too would be the strength to overcome it. Through her courage, she had given the world a chance to correct its wrongs, and that, to her, was the ultimate victory. Your voice matters. Thank you so much for watching. This is a story of resilience, dignity, and the power of standing up for what's right. What happened to Mrs. Banks is something we can't ignore, and it's a reminder that change starts with us. What do you think about the way airlines and other industries treat people of color? Have you ever faced a similar experience? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below and share your story. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe for more, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we can keep pushing for a world where everyone's dignity is respected. Follow us for more stories of change.